Okay, welcome to the first solo episode of Unscripted. See, a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with another multifamily executive about what I kind of consider the de-evolution of the standard security deposit when they asked a really good question, and that is, are deposits dead? It's something I've been thinking about a lot since that conversation, and my goal for this monologue or episode is to make the case that security deposits in rental housing are at a minimum on their way out. But before we get there, quick reminder that the views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the individual host, and just me in this one, and don't necessarily reflect the official policy or position of LeaseLock. The content is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsements. While we strive to ensure the content is as accurate and up to date as possible, LeaseLock makes no representations or warranties of any kind, expressed or implied, regarding the accuracy, completeness, or reliability of the information discussed. Content is provided as is, and LeaseLock assumes no responsibility for any errors or omissions. Listeners should consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the content of this podcast. This podcast may include references to third-party sources, which are provided for convenience and informational purposes only. LeaseLock does not endorse or take responsibility for the accuracy or reliability of any third-party content, and in no event shall LeaseLock, its affiliates, or any of its employees, officers, or agents be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, or consequential damages arising out of or in conjunction with the use or the reliance of the content of this podcast. Okay, now, as I like to say in the other episodes, let's get a bit unscripted. And I think where we should start this conversation is, are they dead? Like, is the standard deposit model dead? And I think an honest assessment of that is obviously no. They're not dead. But I do think that, as I mentioned, I think it's a de-evolving system, and I think it is dying. And what is driving it is, for years now, as operators, we have prioritized occupancy over risk mitigation. And I think that, and I don't mean that as dramatic as that just came out to sound, but if you look at deposits, 15 years ago, let's go back to 2010. The standard deposit, or at least the one that was the most common back then, was 1 month's rent. Back then, that was about $1,600 if you look at RealPage data from market analytics to be able to get that. And over time, we have basically traded the protection or the risk mitigation that 1 month's rent in a security deposit was providing relative to where we are now, where the average is probably somewhere between $250 to $500, or what would equate to about a week's worth of rent. And we did that predominantly because it was a barrier to leasing. We wanted to make it easier for people to lease apartments to raise occupancy, which ultimately should be putting more money to the bottom line, right? And by the way, that worked. Like, again, looking at the occupancy numbers from 2010 versus 2023, we went from 93.8% on average to 94.8% on average. So congratulations, it worked. The problem is occupancy doesn't put revenue in the bank. You've got to be able to actually collect it and keep it. And what we also saw over the course of that 14, 15 years is average bad debt has gone from 50 to 75 basis points-ish to 150 to 200 basis points-ish. So that percentage of occupancy that we were getting by removing this barrier to entry, we literally were giving away through bad debt exposure on the back ends of those leases. And, which leads me to the question, okay, if it's not giving us that protection, why are we still holding on to it? And I think I came up with two answers. And by the way, I'd love it in the comments if you guys give me more on things I'm not thinking about on this. But, I think the first one, they're both pretty obvious, quite honestly. But the first one that's pretty relatively obvious is that ownerships still want protection from bad debt. Again, we think about why a security deposit has existed to begin with. The security deposit was a way that owners and operators could protect themselves on the backside of the lease. It was a way to say that, okay, if the resident didn't hold up their end of the bargain and moved out with a balance due, we have protection from at least some level of that balance due to be able to pull it out of the security deposit before we return it back to them. So owners still want that. Like, that's still a big part of what we're doing. Like, I listened to all the Q3 earnings calls for the REITs, and 6 of them had commentary directly about bad debt exposure and bad debt performance in their prepared comments, let alone questions from the analysts. So it's something obviously that is still widely needed and widely wanted. So that's kind of number one reason why we haven't just evolved into something else. The second one, though, I think goes to the renter experience, and particularly in leasing itself. And that is the thought process that, okay, we want prospects to have, some skin in the game. It has to be someone, we want to prevent the opportunity for someone to go rent at 15 different buildings because the only thing they're losing is a application fee in that process. The security deposit, I think, was a way that we could put more skin in the game and have, that lack of jumping around. So we talked about what people are trying to accomplish with the security deposits and why it just hasn't been allowed to kind of go away. But there are a few inherent challenges with the way security deposits work, both from an operator and an owner perspective, but also from a resident perspective, that I think is worth pointing out when we think about, okay, what would come next? Because what comes next has to kind of address these flaws. And the first one is that they really have become market driven as opposed to owner dictated. Again, they were created and initially put in place as a way that owners could protect themselves from balances due at the end of a lease term or end of a residency, really. And there's not a state in the United States, I did this research, there's not a state in the United States that won't allow at least a 1-month deposit. So in theory, you could have a 1 month anywhere in the country. But again, we mentioned earlier that the average is somewhere between 250 to 500. Why? Well, why is that? Well, if you ask operators, it's because, the market won't bear more than that. If you've got property A and property B, and property A, and they're equal on most things, but property A wants you to pay $1,600, the 1 month deposit. Property B wants you to pay, $500. You're going to go with B because then you get to keep the other $1,100 in your account and put it to the best use that you think it should go to. Whether that is, actually being invested, or whether that is, just making my life a little more breathing room if I can. So that's kind of number one. It's become market driven as opposed to really a vehicle to protect ownership. The second one is it's become a real barrier to leasing. There are lots of different studies out there. Forbes put one out probably 6 months ago or so that shows, the average American, about 70% of them don't have $1,000 in their bank account to be able to facilitate something like a move. That becomes a real issue. If you're going to attract a resident has to be able to actually facilitate the move. So it's become a barrier to leasing that we need to figure out a way to, remove in the leasing process, which again is why it became market driven. It also, though, from an operations perspective, managing deposits have become burdensome, and there is a great deal of risk associated with them now. I won't call out the company because I really like them a lot. In fact, the story was based on me choosing to live at one of their buildings when we were in between homes, but I chose to live at a particular community because of who both owned it and operated it. But when it was time to get my deposit back, it literally took better than 6 months for it to come to me. Now, I'm not going to go after them for that. I certainly wouldn't do that. But if I wanted to, they actually had created a liability for themselves because the deposit wasn't handled in the way that it was actually supposed to be done. It wasn't delivered to me in the time that it was supposed to be done. And there was literally risk that was associated with it that had been taken on by those owners. So, I mean, these are inherent flaws in the system as it stands now that have really contributed to groups moving away from it. Like, there's one area outside of Chicago where the laws around how you have to hold deposits, when you have to pay the interest on those deposits, both intra-residency and post-residency. And more importantly, the penalties for doing it wrong are so onerous and so large that the vast majority of operators in that area just don't charge deposits. They've decided that it is easier and more beneficial to mitigate the risk of being sued than mitigate the risk of someone moving out with a balance at the end of their stay. So, when we think about this, like how do we replace this system? How do we bring a better system in place that protects owners from bad debt at the end of a residency, that has the ability to facilitate leasing? Because again, we've been moving away from these to help facilitate leasing. And what I keep coming back to is, okay, it's lease insurance. It's lease insurance that operates like health insurance does. And I'll walk through this, but really, that's a system that has the ability to benefit all. It's going to benefit ownership, it's going to benefit the operator themselves, and it's going to benefit, most importantly, the resident and the renter, because it needs to be renter friendly, not putting all the burden on the renters. So kind of going from the top, when we think about this from an ownership perspective, obviously the biggest one is if we've got an insurance policy in place that is insuring the collective leases that are under the certificate. Because what I'm talking about is a business to business insurance platform. It's not a business to resident insurance platform. But at that point, we can select coverage levels, just like our property and casualty insurance. We can select coverage levels that very often could increase the level of coverage on a per lease basis. So instead of slowly eating away and decreasing the bad debt coverage we have, we were actually able to increase the bad debt. It would, when well adopted, when you're either offering it as an option, like a zero deposit option, or whether you are collectively just deciding we are a zero deposit community, this is something we do and we're going to pay for this and this insurance. You can either decrease or completely eliminate the risk associated with all that deposit mishandling that we just talked about. And in most jurisdictions, not all, but in most jurisdictions, the cost of a program like that can be passed on directly to the residents who are receiving the benefit of both not having to outlay the cash, but also knowing that if for whatever reason they do have a balance at the end of their lease that they're not able to pay and not make good on the first 30 days, that they're protected. So it's definitely a win for ownership. Now, going down the chain, thinking about operators, not having to handle the deposits, and not having that back and forth literally is a way that they can be more efficient. I mean, this is a way when we think about specialization within multifamily, a lot of what I think about is what can we take off of the plate? What can we, outsource to an automation or an AI? Or in this case, what can we just eliminate by having something else in place? Let's eliminate the deposits and that altogether by having, again, that insurance policy that's in play. But on the front end, I think there's a lot to be said about the way that it can improve the leasing process. One of the challenges within the leasing process, obviously, two things in the leasing process or in any sales process. You want to have full control over how that leasing process goes. You want to be very clear on your communications. When you're a zero deposit community and there's an insurance policy that's in place to cover it instead, number one, you can very clearly advertise that. It can become an amenity. It can do all the things. But unlike, kind of other deposit alternative programs that are out there that are really focused on the resident, and I should say the relationship directly with the resident, I think that, this is definitely what I'm thinking of is definitely resident focused and resident friendly. But when a resident has to go and get a secondary approval and they have to go, because again, if it's an insurance to resident product and relationship, that resident has to be underwritten because insurance is offsetting of risk and that risk is going to be different for every single person. But when it's a business to business platform and the asset is underwritten instead, you've got clarity around it. You know exactly what the cost that you can communicate directly. If you're passing the cost on, if you're building it into an amenity fee, if you're putting it into rent, etc., you're going to communicate it in different ways. But it allows you to never have to pass the resident off to somebody else. They're not going to somebody else's website to go then, and you're following up going, hey, did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? It's all within your control. They know it. It also results in a faster leasing process. We've got, at LeaseLock, we've got the data that shows it's, the time to apply shrinks, as well as in a lot of cases, the vacancy shrinks because the time between move out to move in actually gets shorter. And then the last one that I think is undervalued, but we need to talk about, is the improved relationship, and ultimately should translate into improved reputation, because we're not having these huge barriers and we're not holding on to huge sums of money. And it may not be huge from a real estate perspective, but from a personal finance perspective, some of these large deposits are huge sums of money to those folks. So we're not putting that barrier in between us and our resident base. And, lastly, for the renters, and I save them for last for the end, because I think it's actually the most important out of all of these. Removing that barrier that we talked about and improving residents' ability to choose the housing that they want that's appropriate for that time in their life, I think is something we should all be striving for. I mentioned earlier, but when the average American has less than $1,000, for an unexpected expense, and I would assume that moving and having to pay a new deposit and all the things are a lot of unexpected expenses, being able to move that into either a part of the rent or a subscription-based service, and in the subscription economy we live in now, really does improve the flexibility for residents. The other thing, from this perspective, is it avoids, especially for residents who are prospects who may have had a challenge qualifying, and they're that with conditional, and they would have had higher deposit and those kind of things. It avoids that second underwriting that often happens with other types of platforms that are out there. And then lastly, and I think this is huge, the whole point of the security deposit, again, is to protect the resident from, or to protect the owner from the potential of someone moving out with a balance due. So they have at least some level of coverage on that, and they have the ability to pull it out of that. Well, if they didn't have a deposit, if we're just in a good faith trust world, there's the potential that every single person who moves out with a balance would then be going to small claims court with, the landlord, and they're trying to collect that way, that doesn't do anybody any good. There's nothing positive about that whatsoever. In a lease insurance model that, again, works more like a healthcare platform, when you think about the cost of the overall healthcare is underwritten on, the population level, and you define that population different ways. The same thing could be true from a move out risk and a bad debt risk perspective, when we're thinking about the population being the property. And then the cost of that is spread across all the residents of that property, or spread across to the owner of that property. And that way, when, it's not about the individual with a claim where they're then insurance terms subrogated against, which basically means that they're going and suing them for the balance of it. You've just passed that, responsibility or that ability from owners to the insurance company. A scenario like this actually doesn't involve that. It involves spreading the risk appropriately, doing appropriate underwriting, because that's a key in all of this. But to be able to then do that, and I think that really is, again, how we get to the other side of this dilemma we have with deposits. The idea that we're allowing them to become smaller and smaller and smaller, which is just creating more and more exposure on the back end for bad debt. We still have all of the rules around managing them that just are all rife with risk management for all of us. And then it's creating a barrier to having a better reputation and a better relationship with our residents. So, just something to think about, a little bit different episode here. And it was a great question when it got posed, so I thought I'd put it out here. If you got a good question, love to hear it. Want to hear more about this? Love to hear it. Go say that guy's crazy. Love to hear it. Anyways, have a great day.